back with our second session of the day. Our next speaker is Virginia McBride, a financial aid advisor at Washburn University. Virginia has experience supporting students at Syracuse University, San Francisco State University, and the University of Kansas. Passionate about lifelong learning and community building, Virginia's here to help you finesse your financial aid situation FAFSA and beyond. Y'all give it up for Virginia.
Hi, Color Stack. Thanks for having me back. I think the last time I got to see some of you was at the spring chapter leadership retreat of 2024, so earlier this year. That was sort of in my capacity as a former student leader and someone who's advised student organizations, but I'm excited to be joining you today as a financial aid advisor and someone who wants to help demystify the financial aid process as much as possible. So, we're going to talk about a few different things, and I'm going to share my screen. That way we can follow along with the presentation that will be available for you to reference at any point after today. So whether you go back because you've got some questions about it or because you're encouraging a friend to check out some helpful information, there's always an interesting time presenting to a big group um, about financial aid since it can be so personal. It's also a taboo topic for most Americans. We sort of have this mythology around pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Um, if you want it, work for it, and then everything will be just fine on the financial side. But that is not always the reality. And so realizing that if you're feeling uncomfortable, that's okay. I'm hoping you'll lean into that discomfort around the topic of money because it's really, an important thing for you to understand, not only as college students, but setting that foundation for your entire adulthood. Maybe you've been managing excuse me, money from an early age. Maybe being in college is the first time you're as responsible for your funds as you are now. But I also want to make sure that you aren't experiencing what I feel like I experienced a lot when I was the one tuning into these sorts of things as a college student. And that's that sometimes these conversations can have a lot of assumptions about what resources each person viewing the content has, whether that's money. um, there's only so much you can budget if you've only got $5. So yeah, you can talk about different strategies and different budgeting methods, but if the resources aren't there, they aren't there. And as college students, this might be the time in your life where you're making the least amount of money that you ever will again. So there is some value in getting familiar with those ideas, but my goal is to never assume um, anyone's level of disposable income in general. There's also a lot around mental and emotional capacity. Like I mentioned, money is a taboo topic. Some of us may have the inclination to sort of shy away from things, but um, hopefully, as your fall semester, quarter, trimester is wrapping up and we're getting ready for winter break, you'll have a little bit more time to breathe in between terms, and being able to focus what you can on the financial side of things can help set you up for success in your next semester, quarter, trimester, and just long term for yourself as you finish your degree and make plans for the future. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. But I also want to say that your personal circumstances matter. And so even if we're talking about things as the big group and you wind up having questions about how this relates to you that you don't necessarily want to put in the chat, or um, if you know that you really are uh, familiar with this stuff already, but you're not sure how in your life these things apply, we're going to be having some time afterwards where we'll have a little breakout room we can chat, and hopefully help this information be as applicable to you as possible. So matching your personal circumstances. Financial literacy is a term you may have heard a lot about. I know for me, getting into financial aid after my career of working with students in other functional areas like student housing, I expected there to be a sort of textbook definition. And the reality is, it includes a variety of financial skills and concepts. So the definition can be a little bit nebulous, but some of the key strategies or key concepts are knowing how to create a budget, track personal spending, managing debt, and planning for retirement. A few of those things are a little more relevant to you, as potentially people right out of high school finishing up your first term of college. Maybe it's feeling a little more real if you're getting ready to graduate or if you're a graduate student. I do things around budgeting, personal spending, and making smart decisions around debt with college students. But there's still plenty more for me to learn about planning for my own retirement. Let me put it like that. Financial literacy can also be helpful because of supporting goals you may have for yourself, whether that's saving for future education, retirement, again, that comes up a lot in financial literacy conversations, using debt responsibly, or running your own business. And then it's also helpful because um, in the research that investmentpedia.com did, they found that people who were more financially literate are less likely to be vulnerable to financial fraud. And really, finances um, plays a big role in our lives, and that's why it shows up. I like this model of wellness where there's 8 dimensions of wellness. You may have seen this um, as the wellness wheel. And so having finances be something that you're mindful of and able to approach, whether it is something that's stressful for you or something you're just curious and excited about, that is part of what I get to do in my role and hoping to deal with you all today. So, actually, just got notified that you're not seeing what I'm seeing, and that is a little less helpful because I can certainly talk the talk, but pictures are good too, especially when it comes to helping demystify things. So, let me make sure you can see the slides that I'm on as I'm sharing this. Actually, while I'm trying to pull up these slides again, why don't we do a quick poll? Um, if you were to rate yourself on your own financial knowledge, would you rate yourself as poor, fair, good, or excellent? Feel free to vote if you haven't already. All right, let's go ahead. Let's see those results. So, out of the 92 votes, 50% of you rated yourself as fair. That's fantastic. I know that depending on what part of financial literacy we're talking about, when I really drill down into it, there are some parts where I may feel like I've got a good handle on it. So props to I'll say props to the 5.43% of you who feel like you've got an excellent grasp on financial knowledge. You may have some things to teach me by the end of this. To our good group, 31.52% of you, awesome. I'm very amused that 50% of you have landed in fair because that's just such a nice round number. Um, and 13.04% of you rated yourselves as poor. This is actually better than the results that College Pulse got when they had surveyed students 2 years ago about where they would rate their financial knowledge. 40% of them rated themselves as poor or fair. So, once again, props to everybody for their participation in that poll. Let me get myself caught up to where I thought I was when I was presenting earlier. We'll continue um, where I was leaving off. All right, so here is that wellness wheel I was mentioning, um, and I'm a fan of it because it really helps me think of the different facets of my life. There are certainly many other ways to think about wellness, but being a financial aid advisor, I like that financial shows up as one of the components because I know, for example, that my emotional well being goes down significantly when I am stressed about my financials. So the ways they're all interconnected are important. And the rest of today's going to focus on, excuse me, the rest of my session is going to focus on the financial piece. Specifically, we're going to talk about the FAFSA. And feel free to comment in the chat what's the first thing you think of when you hear the word FAFSA? If you were to say in like maybe 1 to 5 words, short answer, what do you feel? What do you think of? Um, it almost feels like a bad word because so many people feel stressed. Yep, that's actually the very first response I saw. Long. Okay, I've got some potentially exciting news for you a little later. Stressful, tedious, broke, loans, federal aid. Okay, federal aid. Very specific. I like it. Debt. It's gonna crash. Once again, I've got some exciting news for those of you who feel like it's long, it's gonna crash. Um, maybe the people who feel like it's time consuming. So we'll talk about the FAFSA. We'll also talk about scholarships, and then we'll think about what's next, whether that's continuing your undergraduate degree progress or thinking ahead to graduate school. And then we'll have some time for questions as well. So, if you aren't familiar with the FAFSA, it stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And it's how citizens and eligible non citizens can apply for federal financial aid. Normally, or excuse me, a lot of states and some schools will use the information from your FAFSA as well to determine financial aid eligibility. Undocumented and international students aren't eligible for federal financial aid, but some schools, some states may have programs where they'll use information from the FAFSA in order to determine your eligibility for those programs. So, if you're in the state of Kansas, I can tell you the state of Kansas doesn't have anything available to undocumented and international students, but there may be different options depending on where you are. And if that's the case, if your school or if your state is saying, hey, you'll need to fill out the FAFSA, you can do the paper version of that and mail it in to essentially have them calculate um, a score. So all those questions that it asks you are different variables that go into calculating what's known as your student aid index. And that is something that for the federal aid side of things, we interpret for eligibility for things like the Pell Grant, student loans, federal work study. So even though as an undocumented or an international student, you wouldn't be eligible for federal financial aid, if your school or state says that that's what they want you to do, um, know that the paper form is an option. You can mail that in and it'll still calculate what your financial aid office can interpret as something to determine your eligibility for other programs. As far as when you should do the FAFSA, it just opened up earlier this month, and it should go back to opening up October 1st for the 2026 to 2027 academic year. Often I get asked, hey, what's the deadline to file the FAFSA? And if you were to Google what's the deadline to file the FAFSA, the answer is not very helpful because the form itself is available to complete until June 30th, 2026 for the 2025 to 2026 academic year. But if the reason you're filing your FAFSA is to help you pay for school during the 2026 2025 to 2026 academic year, chances are you're going to need those funds sooner than the summer after the semester is ended, or after the academic year is ended. In fact, you may not even be eligible for some programs after your classes have ended. So the actual answer, although it's vague, is that you're going to want to look up the priority date for your school if you don't already know it. And if you do already know it, fantastic. The reason why the priority date is so important is because often schools will use that as a way to review students' eligibility for what we call limited funds. So, federal Pell Grant, federal student loans, typically your eligibility for that will follow you to any other schools participating in the federal student aid programs. But some state or school specific funds may not be enough to cover everyone who's eligible for them. So they'll take the group of people who have filed their FAFSA by their priority date, offer the limited financial aid to those folks, and then if there is some left over, they'll sort of go on a first come, first serve basis after that. But by getting your FAFSA done by the priority date, you know that you're maximizing your aid eligibility because you'll be in that first group that's considered for any limited funds you may otherwise be eligible for. For the school I work at, Washburn University, our priority date is March 1st. Some schools may be in February or even January, so best to check it out and get familiar with what that is sooner rather than later so you don't miss out on that deadline or, excuse me, on that priority date. I say treat it like a deadline. If you miss it, that's okay. You can still go in and do the form, but you might not be eligible for as much financial aid. And if you're filling it out, excuse me, if you're filling it out online, studentaid.gov/FAFSA is the way to get to the FAFSA landing page. If you're filling out a PDF version of it, because you're an undocumented or international student whose state or school is having you do that, the PDF is also available at studentaid.gov. Things that'll help you be prepared to file a FAFSA. If you're filling it out online, you'll want your studentaid.gov account. This was formerly referred to as your FSA ID. And one of the ways they made it a lot shorter for people and a lot um, more streamlined is by having the option, option's a funny word, but essentially they're able to transfer information from the IRS now far more consistently than with the previous data retrieval tool. So maybe you got to do the data retrieval tool, maybe you had to enter it all in. If you've created your studentaid.gov account and it's been verified, which typically takes 1 to 3 days from the time the account's created, then you'll be able to give your consent to have so much of your information transferred from the IRS directly to the Department of Education for the purposes of determining your financial aid eligibility. The FAFSA used to be 108 questions. Starting with last year, it is down to approximately 38 questions, and you may not even be asked all 38 of those questions based on skip logic. Now, last year is still a huge source of stress in my mind. I could tell by some of the responses in the chat to what's the first thing you think of when you think of the FAFSA that some of you, probably a majority of you, had issues with the various glitches of last year's FAFSA fail. That soft rollout that never really ended still may be giving you problems even as we are in December 2024. But my experience of helping at least 30 people fill out the FAFSA so far is that there haven't been any glitches with it. You still may run into issues if, say, you need to add your contributors' information and you don't have their social security number. That's okay. You can save the form, come back to it when you do have that information. But they have really ironed out the wrinkles. I wish this is where we were 12 months ago because I'm still getting stressed out when I think of last year, which is really, the FAFSA for this year. But 2025, 2026 is looking good so far. Um, Adding your contributors was specifically an issue for people. So a few things that I recommend is make sure when you're adding in their information, you are using their legal name. Don't guess on the date of birth. I sit down with students and parents, and it gets a little awkward when the student goes to type in the date of birth. I have some parents um, have a strong emotional reaction when the student doesn't know mom, dad, or parents' birthday. So, don't guess on that one. It's better to just say, I'm sorry, I forgot, than to have the invite not go through because you wanted to save face. And then if your parent or contributor has a social security number, you're going to want to make sure that that's accurate as well. It'll have you enter an email address that actually doesn't need to match their account information for their studentaid.gov account. It's more like it's a push saying, hey, by the way, this student added you to their form. Do you accept their invitation to add your information? So that could be a completely different email address. Maybe they don't even check that email address before, but you have to enter one to send the invite. If you're not sure why the invite isn't going through, or it thinks it goes through, but then your parent logs in, your contributor logs in, and they don't have an invite to accept, you can have them go to their account settings and view the personal and contact information to see what their verified account has listed as their name, date of birth, and it has the last four digits of their social if they have one. The name is especially where people get stuck if they've already checked the date of birth and social, because I was just working with a student last night whose parent legally has a hyphenated name. They've never used that other than legally, but when the student added in um, just the first part of their last name, the invite wasn't going through. Once we got that hyphen in the second part of their name in there, it popped up and it should be instant. So you'll know if you've solved it just by having your contributor refresh their page to see it. And then it's also helpful if you have your 2023 financials handy, whether you filed taxes or if you just have W 2s from working. Even though lots of it, like 95% of it's going to be automatically transferred if your account's been verified, there are some questions, like whether you received an earned income credit, for example, that you may benefit from having that there to reference. One last thing about the FAFSA is that once your FAFSA is submitted, it doesn't mean you're all the way done with it. There could be something that you need to go back in and correct. You may need to verify some information or provide documentation regarding special circumstances or unusual circumstances. Typically, your school will let you know that at the time you would be receiving an aid offer. Some of these will prevent you from receiving an aid offer, or some may change your financial aid offer after it's been generated. So, just because you clicked submit doesn't mean you're all the way done. If you do get notified you need to do anything regarding these like follow up steps, do so promptly. That way, you have the most information available to you about your financial aid as far in advance of the school you're starting as possible. Um, if you're required to write a thank you note for a scholarship, please be sure to do that. I had one student lose out on their scholarship because the donor was very specific about how a thank you note was required. That being said, unless they tell you it's required, don't worry about reaching out to your friendly neighborhood financial aid officer to say thank you. Yes, it's nice, but it's not required unless otherwise stated. And usually that's going to be for some sort of outside scholarship, or in the case of the student I'm thinking of, it was the Alumni Association at a school I worked with that had a specific donor with a specific requirement. And speaking of scholarships, don't let submitting the FAFSA prevent you from applying for more scholarships. So when it comes to scholarship applications, these are my big things. And first and foremost is make sure you're searching safely. Like we just talked about on the FAFSA, it isn't unusual for financial applications to require some personally identifiable information, such as your full name, date of birth, maybe even your social security number. That's less common outside of federal, state, and institutional forms, but um, really you want to make sure that if you're sharing that information with anyone, it's because they are a legitimate scholarship provider who's going to treat that information safely and sensitively. Timing is another big one. For the schools I've worked at, our scholarship applications come out end of fall, beginning of spring, before the next academic year. So if you're waiting until the summertime to start your scholarship search, you may have already missed out on some opportunities. That being said, do your future self a favor, write down those dates and timelines so that when the next year comes around, you're able to get those applications submitted. Or if they haven't passed yet, you're able to plan ahead, maybe over winter break if you've got some time. Different applications will require different things. So some may just require a form, others may ask you to include an essay or short statements, even letters of recommendation. Sort of goes back to timing, knowing these things as far in advance, or if you need someone else to write a letter of recommendation for you, asking them as far in advance is going to help you out significantly. I'm actually a scholarship reviewer as an alumni for one of the schools that I attended, and you can tell for a lot of applications, hey, this is a great student with great potential. I'm not quite getting what I need out of the application. Maybe they didn't follow the prompts specifically enough, and that's sort of what I mean when I say rubrics at the end of that list. There is, if they're asking you for certain things, make sure you touch on those. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but at least make sure that somewhere in there you've checked that box of answering that question, because there are some that I hate to see get marked down from a 10 to a 7 just because they didn't touch on this part of the prompt. So make sure you give yourself enough time to do a draft, go back over your draft, check the requirements. Once again, it's just about maximizing your eligibility for financial aid that's going to help the money come from somebody else and not from you. Last but not least, thinking ahead, if you are continuing in your current degree program, make sure you're filing the FAFSA annually. If you have any scholarships that are renewable for more than the current academic year, make sure you find out what those renewal criteria are. Some common ones at the schools in my area is completing a certain number of credit hours with a certain GPA by the time we get to the next fall. And so heading into a new term can be a good chance to just check in, make sure, am I on track to meet these things, or what GPA do I need to get in order to meet this scholarship renewal criteria? Satisfactory academic progress is a federal standard, so things like the federal Pell Grant, federal student loans, but some states and schools may use it as well. So maintaining a 2.0 GPA, completing at least 67% of the classes that you're enrolled in, and completing your degree within 150% of the published program length. So if it's a 4-year degree, you got to finish it within 6 years. If it's a 2-year degree, you got to finish it within 3. And then keep applying for scholarships. You may be eligible for a scholarship going into next year that you weren't eligible for this year, just based on the classes that you've completed, whether that's at the school in general or in your major. If you're getting ready to graduate or thinking ahead to grad school, it's still a good idea to file the FAFSA if you're eligible to do so. Federal student aid for graduate students is limited to loans, but federal work study um, it's limited to loans and federal work study. So, as far as getting campus employment while you're in grad school to help offset the costs, that's a good way to make yourself an attractive candidate for campus employers. Some employers, especially if you're working and then going back to school, they may offer tuition assistance either in the form of tuition reimbursement. So you pay the money up front, but you turn in your good grades and they'll pay you back for what you had paid. Or they may have scholarships, which sort of help at the beginning of the term. And then our uh, last real piece is the difference. As a graduate student, you may be eligible for graduate assistantships or fellowships. And these are pretty similar to each other, but in case you haven't heard of these terms before, assistantships are different campus employment opportunities, whether that's as a teaching assistant, so helping teach undergraduate courses, researching or supporting faculty research projects. And then as a graduate assistant, you may work in different offices on your campus. So I worked as a graduate assistant in student housing for 1 year of grad school, supervised RAs in their different residential communities. My second year was as a graduate assistant in financial aid, and I've been working in financial aid ever since. Fellowships, that's more of compensation to assist with what you're studying, whether that's a certain degree or certain research that you're doing. So these are pretty prestigious. They're essentially saying, hey, we like what you're doing, or we think you have the potential to do this well enough that it's really, aligned with what we're looking for, or it's really going to further your field. So they may be sponsored by an organization, the school you're going to, or the government. And that's who sets the eligibility requirements for those. It's also how we would consider them to be awarded based on merit, because they're looking at the different things you've done and your potential to do more of that in your field. So, um, I think we ran out of time for questions, and I'm so sorry about that. We do still have the opportunity to connect in the breakout room afterwards. I really hope I'm able to see you there. And that being said, I'll turn it back over to our host. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, give it up for Virginia. Yay. In the comment, in the chat, as well as in the emojis, y'all. Thank you so much, Virginia, for sharing that with us. I know financial aid made a big difference in my college career. So really appreciate you for doing the work. Yay. I hope you're getting all the love. Period. Excuse me. So we're gonna do a giveaway question. Are y'all ready? All right. The giveaway question is, when do you need to fill out your FAFSA? When do you need to fill out your FAFSA? Alrighty, and the right answer was your school's priority deadline. And the winner is Andre Afari. Congrats, Andre. The Color Stack team will be reaching out to you next week about any following steps to get your prize. So thank you again, Virginia, for demystifying the financial aid process. And now we are going to go into another short break. If you still have financial aid questions, join Virginia in the social lounge. Otherwise, take a few minutes to relax, connect with others, drink some water. We'll be back at 3 p.m. for a final treat with the one and only Rami. Okay, y'all? I'll see you.